series where we talk to professors, scholars, activists, anybody who's thoughtful and intelligent and can speak in a thoughtful manner about political division in America today. With us, we were able today, well, not in person, we were able to interview them over the phone and over email, is Daniel Aldrich. He is a professor of political science out of Northwestern University. He was an associate professor of political science at Purdue University, Fulbright research fellow at the Tokyo University. He also worked at USAID. He was an assistant professor of political science, again at Purdue University, again at Tokyo University. He was a Harvard fellow on U.S.-Japan relations, and he was also a professor of political science at Tulane University. He has a Harvard degree, master's, and professorate, PhD in government. He also got a master's in Asian studies from UC Berkeley and University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. An award-winning author, Daniel Aldrich, has published 5 books, more than 70 peer-reviewed articles, and written op-eds for the New York Times, CNN, Asahi Shimbun, that's Japan's major newspaper, along with appearing on popular media outlets such as CNBC, MSNBC, NPR, and HuffPost. Aldrich has spent more than 5 years carrying out field work in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and his research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Fulbright Foundation, and the AB Foundation, or Abe. That's a Japanese foundation named after the last prime minister who was assassinated, I believe. I just read Opposing Views, Association of Political Polarization, Political Party Affiliation, and Social Trust with COVID Vaccination Intent and Receipt. So that was the article that we read. Let me see if I can find that. Is that here? No. Okay. So anyways, he wrote an article on political polarization called Opposing Views, Association of Political Polarization, Political Party Affiliation, and Social Issues. Why did you write this article? It was obvious from the news and everyone behaving around us showed that America was divided. COVID underscored how many of us think about the world. Reactions to politicians in critical moments have divided the country. The spelling errors are mine. So I was trying to type this on the phone from him talking on the phone. So please just bear with me. Did it shock you? So this is my question. Why did you write this article? It was obvious that there was political polarization and that America was divided. COVID underscored how many of us think. Reactions to politicians and critical moments throughout COVID divided the country. Did it shock you to see the reaction to COVID-19? Yes. Yes, it shocked him. COVID was one of the first times where there has been a broader problem for many Americans, and rather than cooperate, we took the opportunity to criticize the government. Surprising people didn't see it as a universal challenge, and let's all come together. COVID happened when there was a lot of skepticism about science and a lot of fake news around before COVID happened. COVID happened during a broader period of us being polarized. How much of this during COVID was Trump's fault? I asked. Versus general background polarization for non-Trump supporters, he was polarizing. Nothing he did could go well. Not sure in this case it was Trump's fault. Oftentimes we want to find a figure to blame for what is going wrong. Not sure it was Trump. Under most presidents, it would have been somewhat divided. Trump's election was a sign of how divided we are, the fact that people chose Trump. So actually, as a professor, he's studying this and he's going, actually, Trump was overly criticized for COVID-19. And any president would have had a hard time. And any president dealing with COVID-19 probably also would have had to deal with the polarization. It wasn't just Trump. That's what he's saying. What ends polarization? What's the question? If COVID-19 killing millions was not good enough, what ends polarization if COVID-19 killing millions was not good enough to bring Americans together, and instead it got us polarized? The research looks into social capital. We have connections to people beyond our family, a good friend that you talk to every day, or a colleague you know in another organization that you call occasionally, and the connections to people in power. The article looks at how these types of connections help us. Even during COVID, we see that these sort of connections can bridge those gaps. These bridging ties is what he called them, seem to work well at bringing people together. Bridging ties make a difference, even though there is a partisan divide. So having people know each other personally as a good friend or colleague in connections across power are bridging ties, and they help to reduce the polarization. Could you actually get to policy differences, or was it a general topic? Okay, yeah. Could you actually get to policy differences and get people to agree is what I was asking. Or was it a general topic? So he's talking about how he was bridging divides, bringing people together. And I said, were you able to get them together because you talked about topics in general, or because you talked about specific policies and they had to choose which one to go? And then he says, the red and blue are not going to agree on a lot of stuff. Once you drill down to a more micro level investigation, at that level, a lot of the difference of national politics strips away. Bridging ties activate at the local level and keep us together on local issues. Won't necessarily work on keeping us together on national issues. You see that? Bridging ties activate at the local level and keep us together on local issues. Bridging ties won't necessarily work on keeping us together on national issues. So bridging ties, his solution to political polarization, he's saying won't work on national polarization because they won't work on national issues because they're inherently focused at the local level. Should we have teachers or a balanced budget? Those are local level ties. Those are local level issues. Hopefully allow us to handle the national conversation. If you think the other team is wrong, even these ties may not be enough. So he doesn't think bridging ties will work at the national issue or solve national polarization. It might calm people down, but it won't solve the national polarization. And if you think that the other team is wrong, even the bridging ties may not be enough to do anything. It's a theory that local people working together leads to those people agreeing on a national polarizing issue. Part of this is pulling out the divisive national issues. It works by not talking about those issues. Political anger is formed through abstraction. I get mad at them in the abstract watching Fox News. These forms of ties have us in contact with each other directly versus what the TV tells us about them. You never actually meet them. So if you think the other team's wrong, it's not going to fix political polarization. Binding ties also don't work on national issues. However, local ties, binding ties can help people be less angry at each other, and that generally is good. A lot of the political anger comes through not being specific about the other side, but talking about them in general. Fox News will say all Democrats are bad. MSNBC will say all Republicans are out to get America. That sort of general abstraction is what causes polarization, at least somewhat, he's saying, with the media. And the fact that the media is not specific about the people they're talking about, but general. Provided this system works, let's say your bridging ties work. How soon till this is fixed? And he says it will not go away in the next 5 to 10 years. So even if you were doing the bridging ties, his solution to fixing this problem will not go away in the next 5 to 10 years. What happens if January 6th happens twice more before we fixed? Whenever someone uses violence to make an impact, it immediately becomes polarized. We had a violent form of terrorism to stop the political process and coating of votes, and both sides immediately used it to make points on the other team. When violence happens, it only encourages people to do more violence. As more January 6th happens, it becomes harder to bring the country back together. January 6th was disruptive, and he's saying whenever there's violence, it encourages more violence. January 6th encouraged violence. If you have another January 6th, it's going to encourage even more violence. You have another one, it's going to encourage even more violence. The more January 6th you have, the more violence is encouraging. And as more January 6th happen, or events like that, it becomes harder to bring the country back together. The left also demonizes the right. Polarizing requires by definition that both sides are willing to say something against the other side. Both sides like the strategy of activating their base with inflammatory rhetoric. If we really want America to be healed, both sides need to reduce polarization. So a lot of professors have been saying that polarization is largely a problem on the right. And he's saying, even if that's true, it doesn't matter. You can't depolarize something until you get both sides to agree, because polarization is caused by two sides being opposing to each other. So you can't depolarize one side and depolarize the situation. Polarization exists because there's two sides. So you have to have both sides. And he says straight up, the Democrats use inflammatory rhetoric to activate their base, just like the Republicans. Both sides will have to stop. What about political polarization studies that say it's 95% of the Republicans' fault? Chris Cruz was a commentator who we covered recently who said basically it's the Republicans. They don't even talk about political polarization anymore. I wrote a book on it, but it's all about the Republicans. Is that okay? What sort of language is exactly what the Republicans say about Democrats? His response: it doesn't matter if it's just Republicans or Democrats. Both sides have to agree to de-escalate or there'll never be de-escalation. Doesn't matter whose fault. Both sides agree to have to calm down or not. So it doesn't matter if it's a majority Republicans, may not be. And even if it was, it doesn't matter. You can't fix polarization by just having the Republicans depolarized. The Democrats will also have to depolarize too. Does it sound reasonable to say the problem is all the Republicans' fault? If we look at the arc of history from the 1860s, then pointing at one party is foolish because both parties shift their stance over time. We have a system that encourages both parties to be extreme and use extreme rhetoric to win elections. So saying that it's all the Republicans' fault is foolish. That's what he says. What about the Durham report? Because it's winning rather than Al Gore. Okay. What about the Durham report that says that Hillary Clinton and the FBI lied about Russian collusion for years in order to attack a political rival? And he says, because winning is the only goal of politicians, rather than make the system work, it's damaging to the system. You want good losers like Al Gore, who don't need to appeal to the basic emotions of disgust and anger to motivate us. Al Gore should have been president, won the popular vote, should have argued with George W. Bush, but didn't. Al Gore dropped contending for the presidency with George W. Bush because he felt it would be bad and polarizing for America. He was a good loser who was willing to not fight all the way because he thought it would destroy the country and tear us apart. You can't have policy discussions if we only have trigger words for a discussion. Can't talk about a report showing Russian interference in the election was less than 1%. Can't comment on things I haven't read. So I was talking to him about the Durham report and what it showed, and I was also talking to him about the scientific study that showed Russian interference in the 2016 election was no more than 1%. He said he can't comment on either of those things. He hasn't read them. But you need good losers like Al Gore who don't need to appeal the basic motions of disgust to motivate us. Both sides fight evidence that the other side is playing in bad faith and then encourages them to go for winning it all, and failing to win means bad guys win control over everything. He's saying both sides need to depolarize because both sides work to find evidence that the other guy is in bad faith and against democracy. And when they feel the other guy is against democracy, it's not just an election and a contest of ideas. It's they're evil and they'll destroy the whole country if they win. So they cannot win that election under any means. And that means the bad guys will win control, which begins to put the idea in your head that anything is reasonable to make sure evil doesn't win. So that is the interview here with this professor. And I think the big takeaway is that he was saying both sides are going to have to depolarize. Even if it is the Republicans, you can't just go, well, they need to work on it and that's it. It's going to have to be both sides. And he's also saying both sides use polarizing rhetoric, and both sides use emotional appeals to their base, and both sides are going to have to undo that. And he also said just the idea academically to say it's all the Republicans' fault is foolish when we look at the arc of history. We'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.